The smell of scorched iron and graphite dust usually clung to Marlene's skin like a second layer of clothing. But as she stood in the damp darkness of her basement, all she could smell was the cloying, floral scent of a cheap perfume emanating from her husband's work jacket. The washing machine groaned in a violent spin cycle, shaking the concrete floor beneath her boots. Yet her hands were deathly still. Between her grease-stained fingers, she smoothed out a crumpled slip of thermal paper. A receipt from a motel on the edge of town, dated for an afternoon when her husband claimed he was too crippled to leave his chair. A sudden, hollow clatter echoed through the kitchen upstairs, followed by the familiar, theatrical groan of a man in pain. Marlene didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the empty ginger snap tin she had pulled from the back of the pantry, its lid rolling across the floorboards like a discarded shell. The college fund she had built shift by grueling shift, breathing in the toxic orange haze of the steel mills for 2 years, was gone. In its place was nothing but a fine layer of gray dust, and the realization that the man currently calling out for his dinner had been feeding on more than just her sacrifices. Marlene Decker ripped the sweat-soaked leather gloves from her hands, her movements mechanical and sharp. Beneath the heavy skin of the gear, her calluses pulsed in a rhythmic, agonizing thrum that mimicked the relentless pounding of the heavy presses. Above the Edgar Thomson steelworks, a thick, suffocating haze clung to the sky, bleeding a toxic orange hue across the Braddock horizon as the sun began its descent. Fine graphite dust crunched between her teeth, a gritty reminder of the shift just ended, and settled deep into the pores of her face, despite the stifling protection of her industrial mask. The air tasted of scorched iron and ancient soot, searing her lungs with every weary breath. She paused for a fleeting second, tracing the jagged trail of rust-colored smoke billowing from a towering stack before dragging her frame toward the plant gates. Her boots, weighted with steel toes, felt like leaden anchors shackled to her shins. Even as she stepped away from the vibrating floor, the roar of the mills continued to ring in her ears, a ghost of the machine that refused to grant her silence. She crossed the threshold of her home, where the wallpaper bubbled in jaundiced blisters and the floorboards groaned under the slightest pressure. Stepping into the kitchen, Marlene pulled a bag of potatoes toward her and began to peel, her knife moving with practiced, desperate speed. Her fingers trembled, a fine vibration born of exhaustion that she fought to suppress. In the adjacent room, Earl lay sprawled in his chair, his legs draped in a greasy, pilled fleece throw, while the children's voices rose in a sharp, jagged crescendo over a broken pencil. Marlene forced a familiar, thin smile onto her face when her son peeked into the kitchen. She offered him a quick, conspiratorial wink, carefully masking the bruised shadows beneath her eyes. The skillet began to hiss, filling the cramped, low-ceilinged space with the heavy scent of cheap lard and frying onions. Wiping her brow with the back of her hand, she left a smear of industrial grime across her forehead, her voice humming a low, tuneless melody to drown out the house's decay. Marlene set a plate of steaming, gray-brown stew before Earl, moving with a cautious grace to avoid his extended leg. Earl's face contorted immediately, his hand clutching at his lower back as he let out a long, theatrical groan that vibrated through the small room. The sound hit Marlene like a physical blow to the chest. As she poured the tea, the steam rising to dampen her cheeks, Earl launched into his nightly litany. He spoke of the cruelty of fate, of a world that stripped a man of his utility and discarded him like slag. He poked a fork at a chunk of gristle, his voice rising in a sharp whine as he complained about the toughness of the meat and the government's failure to respect the dignity of a wounded laborer. Marlene nodded in a rhythmic, silent cadence, sliding the salt shaker toward him without meeting his gaze. Every word he uttered fell into the heavy silence of the kitchen, like a stone dropped into a deep, stagnant well. ripples of bitterness spreading through the air. Later, Marlene moved through the house with the efficiency of a scavenger, plucking discarded socks and juice-stained shirts from the floor. She descended into the basement, where the air held the sharp bite of damp concrete and the suffocating weight of ancient mildew. The laundry basket balanced on her hip. She navigated the dim space. A single naked bulb swayed overhead, casting elongated skeletal shadows against the weeping walls as she sorted the whites from the grimy darks. The aging washing machine began its violent, rhythmic dance, filling the cellar with a vibration that hummed through the soles of her feet and settled in her knees. She reached for Earl's work jacket, a relic he still wore despite his idleness, noticing the slick patches of machine oil and strange, white flakes clinging to the fabric. Methodically, she slid her hand into the deep side pockets, checking for a stray lighter or forgotten change before the garment met the water. Her fingers brushed against something sharp and crinkling, tucked deep into the frayed lining of the pocket. She fished out a tight, crumpled ball of paper that released a faint, cloying scent of cheap cologne and stale tobacco. Her palm tightened instinctively around the wad, the jagged edges of the paper biting into her skin, while the washing machine behind her shifted into a frantic, thundering spin cycle. Marlene froze, her head tilting toward the ceiling as she listened for Earl's heavy footfalls, but heard only the muffled, electronic drone of the television news. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a dull thudding that echoed in her temples. Under the weak, flickering light of the bulb, she slowly smoothed the paper flat. It wasn't a grocery list or a tattered prescription. The sight of the ink made the blood in her veins turn to slush, a coldness that had nothing to do with the basement's draft. Her eyes locked onto the logo of the Haven Motel, printed in a fading clinical font on a strip of gray thermal paper. The date was last Thursday. The time was 3 in the afternoon, a window when Earl claimed he was enduring a grueling physical therapy session at the county hospital. Marlene stared at the total, a sum that covered a room and incidentals, and felt her insides knot into a hard, frozen lump. Her fingers began to shake, a fine tremor that made the lines on the receipt blur into illegible black smears. A memory flickered in her mind. Earl returning that evening, his face twisted in performative agony, begging her for a heating pad and an extra dose of aspirin. She stood paralyzed, the chill of the concrete floor seeping through her thin slippers and anchoring her to the spot, her mind unable to process the betrayal. Marlene whispered a frantic string of excuses to the empty room, telling herself he might have given a friend a ride or found the scrap on the sidewalk near the pharmacy. The logic crumbled the moment she recalled the way Earl had averted his eyes when she asked about his doctor's visit that day. A wild, jagged suspicion surged through her, propelling her out of the basement and up the stairs. She bypassed the room where Earl remained mesmerized by the news, her movements silent, the agility of a thief guiding her around the floorboards that she knew would scream. She slipped into the narrow pantry behind the kitchen, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. She dragged a wobbly stool toward the wall, her movements frantic yet hushed. Her fingers gripped the edge of the top shelf, brushing against the cold, tacky film of kitchen grease that coated everything in the house. She reached for the heavy tin that once held ginger snaps, a container decorated with faded, cheerful Christmas reindeer. It felt wrong. The weight was non-existent. As she pried the lid off, expecting the muffled thud of a thick roll of bills secured with a rubber band, she heard only an insulting, hollow, metallic clatter. This was 2 years of double shifts, 2 years of breathing iron dust and ignoring the ache in her bones for her son's future. In the dim light of the pantry, she saw only a fine layer of gray dust settling on the bottom of the empty tin. Marlene tipped the tin over, her palm outspread in a desperate hope that the currency had simply stuck to the sides. Instead of the hundreds she had painstakingly stashed, a miserable handful of tarnished cents and a few crumpled slips of paper tumbled onto her skin. She smoothed one out, recognizing the letterhead of Rite Aid and the names of high-dosage painkillers that Earl's insurance had stopped covering months ago. The emptiness in the tin felt like a black hole, an abyss that had swallowed her son's college tuition and every drop of sweat she had shed on the factory floor. She squeezed her fist until the edges of the copper coins bit into her palm, leaving deep, angry red welts in her flesh. She emerged from the pantry slowly, clutching the empty tin to her chest like a piece of battered armor. Through the doorway of the living room, she could see the back of Earl's head, his silhouette framed by the flickering blue light of the television. He was scraping the last of the stew from his bowl, a satisfied, guttural grunt escaping his throat as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. When a canned laugh track erupted from the screen, Earl's shoulders shook with a genuine, hearty chuckle. Marlene stood in the shadows, watching the broad expanse of his back and the casual way he rested his feet on the ottoman. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ground together, and a low, pulsing roar began to build in her ears, drowning out the sound of the sitcom. The dawn sun in Braddock struggled to pierce the thick layer of industrial smog as Marlene pulled her rusted pickup into the deep shadow of a sprawling oak. Across the street sat the Haven Motel. She recognized the dented bumper and the jagged crack on the windshield of Earl's car, parked directly in front of room 13. The door creaked open, and Marlene watched a young woman step out, adjusting a short skirt and a stained apron bearing the logo of Joe's Diner. Earl followed her onto the concrete walkway, his hand lingering on the doorframe, a carefree, easy smile lighting up his face. A look Marlene hadn't seen directed at her in a decade. She gripped the steering wheel, the leather wrap groaning under the pressure of her white-knuckled hold. Marlene dove behind the corner of a brick building as Earl turned his head toward the road. The rough, cold texture of the masonry bit into her shoulder, but she remained motionless, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the sob clawing at her throat. Through a gap in the rotting fence boards, she watched Earl draw the waitress toward him. He ran his fingers through her blonde hair with a predatory, youthful energy that made Marlene's stomach turn. These weren't the clumsy, obligatory gestures he offered on anniversaries. There was a hunger in his movements that felt like a physical assault. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of Earl kissing the stranger in the gray morning light remained burned into the back of her eyelids. At the plant, the roar of the machinery felt like a physical weight, 1,000 hammers striking the inside of her skull. Marlene stood at the controls of the heavy press, her hands moving by rote, but her mind was a chaotic swirl of motel receipts and the waitress's face. For a fraction of a second, her focus faltered. She forgot to clear the steel blank. The massive plate thundered down, missing her fingertips by a fraction of an inch. A spray of sparks rained down on her heavy denim coveralls, and the sharp, acrid scent of singed wool filled the air. The floor foreman, a man with a face the color of raw beef, stormed over. He screamed into her ear, his spittle hitting her cheek as he demanded she get off the line before she destroyed herself or the equipment. When she returned home, Marlene tripped over her son's backpack, which had been tossed carelessly in the entryway. A white slip of paper protruded from a side pocket. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she read the notification of Toby's expulsion for chronic truancy and fighting. Reaching deeper into the bag, her hand brushed against the hard, rectangular shape of a pack of Marlboros. The smell of cheap tobacco drifted up, mixing with the scent of old dust in the hallway. Marlene sank to the floor right there in the entryway, staring at the bright red box in her hand. It felt like one more piece of debris from a life that was rapidly disintegrating into a pile of ash. Toby tried to shoulder past her toward his room, his movements quick and furtive. Marlene blocked his path, the school's letter shaking in her hand as she held it up. Toby didn't flinch. His eyes burned with a cold, jagged defiance, and his lip curled into a sneer of pure contempt. When she reached out to grab his shoulder, he wrenched himself away with a violent jerk that sent her stumbling back against the wall. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her elbow. Toby spat out that she was the one who had turned the house into a morgue, a place that smelled only of soot and failure. Marlene watched him slam his door, the echoes of his voice ringing in her ears and draining the last of her resolve. At dinner, Earl spun a seamless yarn about his afternoon, claiming he had spent 3 hours in the lobby of a logistics firm, hoping for a dispatcher job. He sighed with a practiced, weary sorrow as he described a fictional manager who had turned him away because of his back. Marlene poked at her food, her eyes fixed on his face as he reached across the table to pat her hand. He asked for another $50 for gas, claiming he had an interview in the next county. The lie was so smooth, so effortless, that Marlene felt a wave of vertigo. For a moment, she wondered if she was the one losing her mind. A bitter, thick knot formed in her throat, making every breath a struggle. The next morning, Marlene stood before the narrow glass window of the bank, her savings book clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The clerk, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, tapped at his keys for a long time before looking up with a gaze full of pity. He informed her that the balance stood at $12. Earl had made a series of large cash withdrawals over the past month. Marlene stared at the printout where her son's future had once been recorded in neat black ink. Every line on the ledger felt like a lash across her back. The quiet whir of the bank's printer sounded like a final, irrevocable sentence, cutting off any hope of a quiet escape. She sat on a bench in the town square, where the paint had long ago peeled away to reveal the rotting wood beneath. Dead leaves skittered around her feet, driven by a biting wind off the Monongahela. In Braddock, she had no family left, no friends with the means to take in a woman and 2 failing children. She realized that a divorce now would leave her with half of nothing, and she and the kids would end up on the sidewalk in front of a boarded-up house. Marlene looked down at her hands, rough, scarred, and stained with the permanent gray of the mill, and felt a terrifying, icy despair settle over her, turning her limbs to stone. Marlene entered the house as the shadows of dusk swallowed the rooms, leaving the lights off. On the living room wall, right above the faded family portrait, she noticed a new, jagged crack snaking through the wallpaper like a black vein. From the depths of the armchair came the rhythmic, rattling snore of Earl, who slept with his head back and his mouth wide open. The sound held a profound indifference to the fact that their home was literally crumbling around them. Marlene stood in the darkness, listening to the cadence of his breath and the soft, dry hiss of falling plaster, and felt the last tether inside her snap with a silent, final click. She pressed her forehead against the cold window pane, watching the Braddock skyline vanish behind a wall of black, churning clouds. The first drops of rain, heavy and slick with industrial grime, struck the frame with a dull thud, leaving streaks of soot behind. The sky over the steelworks pulsed with a bruised purple light before the storm finally broke. Marlene felt the damp chill of the glass seep through her sweater, a cold that seemed to settle in her marrow. Outside, the wind shrieked through the gutters, making the ancient timber of the house groan in protest. Through the gloom, she watched Toby's empty swing set in the yard whip back and forth, a ghost in the downpour. A violent crack of thunder shook the house, making the glassware in the cabinets rattle like teeth. Marlene flinched as a wet, tearing sound erupted from the ceiling directly above the dining table. The first drop, thick, gray, and heavy with decades of attic dust, hit the center of the wooden table. It bloomed into a dirty stain. More followed in a rhythmic, mocking beat that sounded like a ticking clock. Marlene watched the water track down the old light fixture, causing the bulb to flicker with a dying yellow light. The puddle on the table spread rapidly, soaking into the wood's grain and spilling over the edge onto the linoleum. She stood frozen, mesmerized by the way the ceiling was bleeding filth into her home. Earl's heavy footsteps made the floorboards shriek before his massive frame filled the doorway. He didn't reach for a bucket. Instead, he slammed his fist against the doorframe, sending a shower of plastered dust onto the floor. His face was a mask of crimson fury, the veins in his neck bulging like blue cords. He jabbed a finger toward the leak, roaring at Marlene for her laziness and her failure to hire a roofer last summer. His voice rose over the roar of the rain, a torrent of bile that filled the room. Marlene listened to the accusations, feeling his spittle hit her face, mixing with the gray water dripping from the ceiling. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing the stiff, damp edges of the evidence. Without a word, she laid the motel receipt and the empty bank statement on the wet, slick surface of the table. The paper soaked up the grime instantly, the ink on the receipt beginning to run into charcoal smears. Marlene slid the papers across the table, nudging them toward Earl's clenched fists. Her eyes remained locked on his face, tracking every twitch of his jaw. The water from the ceiling struck the receipt directly, as if trying to wash away the sin. But Marlene didn't look away from the sudden, pale shock on Earl's face. Earl's momentary silence vanished, replaced by a frantic, white-hot rage that twisted his features. He lunged forward, looming over her, the smell of stale tobacco and cheap bourbon rolling off him in waves. He didn't offer an excuse. Instead, he began to scream that she had turned herself into a machine, a creature that smelled of grease and iron. He spat that her exhaustion and her scarred hands had castrated him, driving him toward a woman who still knew how to smile. His words were calculated strikes, his sneer deepening as he looked at her soiled work clothes. Every sentence he shouted sounded like a final, jagged tear in the fabric of their marriage. Marlene grabbed a kitchen towel, a desperate instinct to save the table from the filth. But Earl was faster. He clamped his hand around her wrist, twisting it with a strength that forced her to drop the cloth. He snatched the towel and whipped it into the corner, where it hit the wall with a wet slap and slid down, leaving a gray streak on the wallpaper. His insults grew louder, his voice a jagged edge as he called her a worthless anchor, a woman who couldn't even keep a roof over their heads. Marlene felt the heat of his grip, the skin of her wrist turning a mottled red. She didn't cry out. She only watched the wet rag crawl down the wall. Toby's silhouette appeared in the dim hallway, his shoulders hunched and his fingers white as he gripped his backpack straps. A flash of lightning illuminated his face, catching the tremor in his lip and the cold, adult hatred in his eyes. He didn't look at his mother. His gaze was fixed on Earl, who was still wildly gesticulating and shouting. In that look, Marlene saw something far worse than fear. She saw a profound, incurable disgust for the man Toby had once called father. The boy stepped back into the shadows, but his presence remained in the room like a heavy, invisible weight that made Marlene straighten her spine. Earl suddenly pulled his hand back, his arm cocked for a blow intended to silence her forever. Marlene didn't flinch. She didn't tuck her head or close her eyes. She planted her feet firmly on the linoleum and squeezed her fists until her knuckles turned the color of bone. A cold, unnatural calm flooded her body, pushing out the last traces of fear. She stared directly into his dilated pupils, her gaze sharper than any blade. Earl's fist hovered inches from her face, trembling with a frustrated, impotent malice. She could feel the heat radiating from him, but it broke against the wall of her own icy indifference. He didn't swing. A sharp crack, loud as a gunshot, echoed from the ceiling as a massive slab of sodden plaster gave way. The heavy, gray mass slammed into Earl's half-eaten dinner, sending a fountain of cold gravy and grit into the air. Thick droplets of sauce and white dust coated Marlene's cheek and splattered across Earl's clean shirt. The table was a ruin of ceramic shards, ceiling debris, and stagnant water. Earl recoiled, wiping his face with a frantic, disgusted motion. But the filth only smeared into his skin. Marlene felt the cold sludge slide down the back of her neck. But she didn't move to clean herself. She simply watched the physical collapse of their life. Earl threw his head back and erupted into a harsh, barking laugh that was more terrifying than the thunder. He pointed a finger at her, sneering that without his veteran's checks, she wasn't worth a damn cent in this dying town. He began to recite the bills she would never be able to pay alone, mocking her with a future in a homeless shelter. His laughter turned into a hacking cough, but he didn't stop, savoring the image of her ruin. He called her a mill rat, who would rot in poverty with her delinquent son if she ever tried to cross him. Every word fell into the puddle on the table like poisonous lead. Marlene looked at him and suddenly saw nothing but sagging skin, yellowed teeth, and a hollow, sucking vacuum where a soul should be. The man she had destroyed her health for was nothing more than a parasite, a creature who used his old injuries as a shield for his own rot. She realized in that moment that Earl hadn't just been taking her money. He had been feeding on her life, growing fat on her sacrifices while he despised her for making them. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought a hard, crystalline clarity. The man standing across from her wasn't her husband. He was a stranger she no longer recognized. Marlene took a single step forward, the heavy thud of her work boots cutting through the rumble of the storm. Her voice was no louder than the hiss of the rain, but it carried the grinding weight of a steel cable. "Get out of my house, Earl." Earl froze, his mouth hanging open as his next insult died in his throat, replaced by a pathetic, wet wheeze. Marlene extended her arm, pointing a scarred finger toward the front door, her hand as steady as the machines she operated. Her gaze pinned him to the spot, stripping away the last of his bravado. The air in the kitchen seemed to warp with her fury as Earl began to back away, his spine hitting the refrigerator with a dull thud. She reached for a battered canvas duffel bag from the peg by the door, the fabric smelling of mothballs and cellar damp. With a violent jerk, she threw open the closet doors and began to scoop up Earl's flannel shirts and grease-stained trousers in great, frantic armfuls. The fabric groaned and tore under the pressure of her grip as she shoved the mess into the bag. Earl tried to grab her wrists, but she shook him off with a snarl, his hands feeling like nothing more than annoying insects. When the zipper snagged, she yanked it with such force that the metal teeth ripped from the track. She refused to look at him, focusing only on the heap of rags that represented his presence in her home. Earl braced his hands against the doorframe, his voice cracking as he shouted about shared property and his rights as a veteran. Marlene didn't argue. She pulled the damp bank statement from her pocket and shoved it against his face. The paper stuck to his nose, forcing him to see the red circled withdrawals that had been meant for Toby's future. She moved in close, her face inches from his, until he could smell the industrial soap and the cold scent of the mill on her skin. She opened her hand, letting the paper flutter down into the dirty puddle at his feet. The silence that followed was heavier than any of his screams. Toby stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, his tall, angular frame appearing like a monolith against the flickering kitchen light. He stood to his mother's right, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles shone. His breathing was slow and rhythmic, a heavy sound in the small room. He looked down at Earl with a gaze that held no trace of a son's love, only a deep, abiding coldness. Earl looked from Marlene to the boy, and his shoulders finally slumped, his entire body seeming to shrink. Toby took one short, lethal step toward him, and Earl stumbled over the threshold, unable to face the combined weight of their silent hatred. Marlene grabbed Earl by the elbow and shoved him toward the door with a sudden, explosive strength. The soles of his slippers skidded on the wet linoleum as she marched him out into the driving sheets of rain. On the porch, Earl turned back, his thin hair instantly matting to his skull. Marlene gripped the handle of the heavy oak door and threw her weight into it. The crash of the wood hitting the frame shook the very foundations of the house, swallowing Earl's final, desperate cry. She twisted the heavy deadbolt with a sharp, metallic click, the sound of the bolt sliding into place, marking the absolute end of their life together. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling the faint vibration of Earl's fists striking the other side. His muffled curses and whining pleas drifted through the grain, but she only tightened her grip on the handle. The blows grew weaker, eventually turning into a frantic scratching of nails against the paint. Slowly, the roar of the receding storm moved back in, drowning out his noise until there was only the steady drum of rain on the porch roof. Marlene closed her eyes, breathing in the sudden, profound silence of the house. The crushing weight in her chest began to lift, replaced by a hollow, clean space where Earl used to be. Marlene climbed the stairs to the second floor, her joints aching with every step. In the back of the linen closet, she found the old galvanized buckets, their surfaces dulled by a thick layer of dust. She carried them down and set them beneath the largest gaps in the kitchen ceiling, the metallic ring of the first drops hitting the bottom echoing through the room. She dropped to her knees and began to push a heavy rag across the floor, soaking up the gray sludge into a basin. Her back throbbed, but she worked with a methodical, rhythmic focus, wringing the cloth out again and again. In the simple, repetitive labor, she found a strange peace, scrubbing away the ruin the storm and Earl had left behind. The first rays of a gray, washed-out dawn were hitting the kitchen table when Marlene noticed the forgotten pack of Marlboros. Toby walked into the room, squinting against the light, and stopped when he saw her holding the box. Marlene picked up the cigarettes, her fingers feeling the rough texture of the cardboard, and dropped them into the trash can as Toby watched. She reached for the canister of wet coffee grounds and dumped them over the pack, burying the red box in a soggy black mess. Toby stood motionless, his jaw tight, but he didn't move to stop her. When she looked up, he offered a single, sharp nod, an unspoken acceptance of the new order in their house. She threw open the garage door, letting in the cool, sharp scent of wet grass and gasoline. In the corner, buried under a pile of old rags, she found the heavy steel toolbox. She dragged out a roll of black roofing felt that had been sitting there since they moved in, the material sticky and smelling of tar. Marlene's hands were quickly coated in the black resin, but she didn't care, gripping the roll tighter. She tested the edge of a utility knife with her thumb and stuffed a handful of wide-headed roofing nails into her pocket. The weight of the tools felt solid and honest, a preparation for the battle with the roof she was no longer willing to lose. Marlene climbed onto the peak of the roof, the cold Braddock wind whipping against her face. Before her, the town stretched out in shades of rust and gray, the stacks of the Edgar Thompson plant belching a thick orange smoke that caught the morning light like gold. The Monongahela glittered below like a new saw blade. She took a deep breath, the air finally clear of the storm's weight, and found she could breathe without the familiar ache of soot. The world felt vast and terrifyingly open. The height didn't make her dizzy. Instead, it gave her a sense of jagged, hard-won freedom standing atop the ruins of her old life. She pressed the edge of the felt against the rotting boards and took her first swing with the hammer. The sharp, ringing crack of metal on metal echoed over the sleeping neighborhood, a signal of intent. She drove nail after nail into the wood, the strength in her shoulder born from years on the factory line. The new patch laid flat and true, covering the hole where the filth had poured through just hours before. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the grime of the shift, but she didn't slow down. With every strike, she wasn't just fixing a roof. She was hammering out the foundation of her own independence, reclaiming the house inch by inch. Marlene climbed back down into the kitchen, where Toby had already set out 2 clean plates. She sat across from her son, the space between them finally empty of Earl's shadow. The morning light poured through the scrubbed window, highlighting the cracks in the walls that she now knew how to mend. She picked up a piece of bread, feeling its warmth, and met Toby's steady, quiet gaze. The path ahead was a long stretch of double shifts and mounting debt. But as she took the first bite, the taste of the simple food was the cleanest thing she had known in years.